The topics discussed in this podcast are sensitive in nature. Listener discretion is advised. Part 1 of this episode takes us to Reedley, California, back to the summer of 2023. In the heart of town, inside an ordinary-looking building hidden in plain sight, something strange was happening. Could it have been the mystery behind the Reedley biolab? Rumors of international spies that piqued the public's interest? In Part 2, we will hear from a local resident who has lived in Reedley for more than 30 years and who, like many residents, drove by the lab dozens of times, unsuspecting of what would soon be discovered inside. It all started with a green garden hose. It was a garden hose that was not supposed to be there. It was sticking out of a hole that was drilled into the side of a building. This building was a warehouse that sat quietly on I Street in Reedley, California. Reedley is a town of about 26,000 people. It's surrounded by farmland and orchards. And that warehouse, well, it was supposed to be empty. It should have been empty for about 10 years. But again, in December of 2022, Reedley Code Enforcement Officer Jessalyn Harper noticed something really strange, and it was that green garden hose that was sticking out of the building. So Officer Harper drove to the front of the building and knocked on the door. A man opened the door and she showed her badge, and reluctantly, they let her come inside the warehouse. Now, Jessalyn was not prepared for what she was going to see inside that warehouse. Inside, it was like a scene out of a science fiction movie.
And I observed other building violations such as electrical and some structural compromisation, which allowed us to post the building unsafe to occupy.
Harper also noticed people in white lab coats, goggles, gloves, masks. They were working, typing, they were sorting stuff. A lot of activity was going on inside this building that, remember, it should have been empty. So Jessalyn asked who they were. They told her they were PRC nationals or People's Republic of China nationals. And during her walk, she also noticed all of these freezers. There was rows and rows of freezers, ultra low grade freezers. Some of these freezers had glass doors. Inside, there were thousands of vials. And some of these vials were labeled. Some were labeled in Mandarin, others were labeled in English, and others were labeled in this weird code. It was a mix of Mandarin and English, and Officer Harper didn't know what that meant. But there was a few of these vials that were labeled in English, and Officer Harper noticed that some of the names on there were dengue, HIV, Ebola, herpes. She wasn't too sure about what she was looking at, but she knew that something inside this building that was supposed to be empty was just not right. So again, she was following this green garden hose inside the building. She followed it deeper into the building, down this long hallway. And you guys, the smell got to her before she even walked in the room. So she followed this garden hose all the way to the back hallway, and then there was this smell that was coming out of this room. So when she walked into the room, she saw cages of mice. These were white mice, and she could tell that they were not being taken care of. She could tell that the conditions that these mice were living in were not good. And later, Jessalyn learned that these were not just any ordinary mice. They were transgenic mice. They were genetically modified to mimic the human immune system. Now, according to the women who were there tending to the mice, these women were also in lab coats. These mice were being used to test COVID-19. So what started as a code enforcement violation, that green garden hose that broke this case wide open, Jessalyn did not realize that this was going to become one of the most bizarre and disturbing cases in California's history. Now, the warehouse wasn't just unlicensed. It was operating completely off the grid. There were no permits, there was no oversight, nothing. Remember, it was supposed to be an empty building, but yet a lot of things were happening inside this building. And the most disturbing part is that this warehouse was just steps from downtown. So the police department's nearby, the water supply is nearby. So this warehouse, this lab, all of these substances, all of these chemicals were just steps from residents. So the man running it, he called himself David He, but that was not his real name. His real name was Jia Bei Zhu, also known as Jesse Zhu.
According to the federal complaint, Zhu has a checkered past. Not only did he try to come over to the U.S. from China 7 times in the early 2000s, they also say he used several aliases, including a spider web of shell companies to hide his business dealings. The filing says back in 2016, he operated a company in Canada that was sued for $300 million over, quote, misappropriating technology over bull semen. An Epoch Times report says that Zhu was sentenced to 6 months in jail, but says he left Canada. Somehow, the federal complaint says Zhu was able to get a United States citizen and immigration services card under a new name, David He.
So David He had multiple aliases. Jesse Zhu, there were so many aliases that when he showed up to court after he was arrested and charged, the attorneys and the judge were having a difficult time trying to determine what to refer to him as. So for the purpose of this podcast, and because I don't want to confuse anybody, I'm going to continue to refer to him as David He. So now David He, with all of these aliases, was running the secret lab in Reedley, California. Now, before Reedley, he had a similar illegal lab in Fresno. That lab caught fire and they were evicted. They were told to move out, so they got kicked out, and that's when they started to make their way to Reedley. We also know that he had another lab in Tulare County. I'm not sure if it was in Visalia or Tulare, but we do know that he had a couple of labs before he moved the operations to Reedley. Now, this lab was operating under 2 names. It was Universal Meditech Inc. and Prestige Biotech Inc. Now, in March of 2022, investigators got a warrant. They entered the lab for a full inspection. What they found not only matched, but surpassed what Zhaoyan Harper had initially found. There were tons of freezers, like we said. They were holding biological material. It was unlabeled. Thousands of these vials were there. And like we said, they were labeled in some weird code that nobody could decipher. Now, these freezers were holding this biological material. They didn't know what it was. It looked like tissue, blood. It was bodily fluids. There was a lot of things in there that were just so questionable. People did not know what they were looking at. And some of the vials were stored in ultra low freezers. So these are freezers that go down to negative 80 degrees. So some of these substances were being stored in these really, really low grade freezers. These are the kinds of freezers that are used to store very dangerous materials. So the CDC was brought in, and among the pathogens that they discovered, this is only a few of the pathogens. Some were chlamydia, E. coli, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HIV, dengue. There was also Ebola. Some of them were labeled with Ebola. And like I said, these are just a few. This is just to name a few. Now, there were also cabinets with highly flammable material and corrosive chemicals, trace amounts of narcotics. And there were also boxes of faulty medical devices like COVID tests and pregnancy tests. None of this was approved, and none of it was safe. So one of the strangest discoveries that officials found inside this lab were these codes. Some of these vials that were stored in these ultra-low freezers had labels that were written in code, and nobody could decipher the codes. And to this day, you guys, the most disturbing thing is that these codes were never broken. So to this day, investigators don't know what some of these vials contained. Well, that means that we may never know what was actually stored inside the Reedley Biolab. Eventually, charges were filed against David He. He was charged with fraud and lying to the FDA. Investigators say he imported and sold hundreds of thousands of these COVID tests and pregnancy tests online. He lied about who he was. He lied about his companies. There was shell company after shell company. And all of this was coming from this warehouse in Reedley. And it all began with that green garden hose and the code enforcement officer, Zhaoyan Harper. The questions that still remain: what was going on inside this lab? What were these vials? What were these pathogens really being used for? Was this an attempt at biological warfare against society? Or was it something just a misunderstanding? Was this man just running a shady business? He was misunderstood, and he really was trying to sell COVID tests, and he was really trying to sell different tests for different diseases. What was it? We will never know. David He is not saying much. We'll never know what the true intent was behind these shell companies, behind these pathogens, behind the mice. Because sometimes, you guys, the biggest stories, the biggest secrets come out of the smallest towns.
Thank you for listening to After the A Block. Join us next time. We'll be talking to a local resident who was born and raised in Reedley. He'll give us an inside look on the building and what it was before it became an illegal lab.